Every state claims that the currency it uses is strong and reliable. Every government tries to convince people that the economic system it has established is permanent, but history has repeatedly shown us that this is not really the case. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy during the American Civil War to modern-day Lebanon, millions of people have woken up one morning to find that the money they had saved for years had almost lost all of its value. Wages lost purchasing power, trusted financial systems collapsed, and people's future plans were suddenly turned upside down. In fact, economic collapses are not as rare as we might think. When we look at history, we see that this has happened many times before. The real question is not whether a system will collapse, but how we can protect ourselves when it does. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that the current system will continue in exactly the same way forever. We look at our bank accounts and the currency we use, and we assume they will always be safe. Yet the true value of money comes from the trust placed in it. And when the trust disappears, everything can change very quickly. That is exactly why history does not only tell us about the past, it also provides important lessons. Every economic crisis leaves behind similar patterns. It clearly shows what truly retains its value and what can disappear overnight. And when you look at all these examples, one common point stands out. Those who survive such periods with the least damage are not the ones who blindly trust the system, but those who identify potential risks in advance and prepare accordingly. One of the best examples of this is the Byzantine Empire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Byzantium lasted for nearly 1,000 years, and the foundation of its economy was a gold coin called the solidus. This coin gained such a strong reputation that it was accepted without hesitation across trade networks stretching from Europe to the Middle East. For many years it became one of the most reliable means of payment for merchants, almost functioning as the common currency of its time. But Byzantium also failed to learn from the mistakes made before it. Years earlier, the Roman Empire had undermined trust in its currency by continuously reducing the amount of precious metal in the denarius, a silver coin. Despite the centuries that passed, Byzantium followed a similar path. This time it was the solidus. The purity of the gold coins was gradually reduced, and cheaper metals began to be mixed in. At first, hardly anyone noticed these changes. However, over time, people began to lose trust in the currency. The solidus, once one of the most reliable means of payment in Mediterranean trade, lost its former reputation. As a result, not only did the value of the currency decline, the long-standing stability of the Byzantine economy was also severely shaken. So who came out of this process with the least damage? Of course, not those who blindly trusted the promises of the state. People who accumulated real gold or converted their wealth into tangible assets such as land were able to preserve most of their savings. Everyone else could only watch helplessly as the value of their money gradually eroded day by day. And this is the first important lesson history teaches us. Governments can choose to devalue their currency when they need to. In such periods, people tend to turn toward assets that cannot be easily created and that are able to preserve their real value. However, the only cause of economic crises is not governments devaluing money. Sometimes an unexpected event can completely disrupt all balances. Wars, epidemics, or major disasters. Each of these can shake even the strongest-looking economies in a very short time. In the mid-14th century, Europe faced one of the most devastating pandemics in its history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, nearly half of the continent's population lost their lives. Cities fell silent, many villages were completely abandoned, and trade almost came to a halt. However, this epidemic did not only affect millions of lives, it also fundamentally transformed the economy and created unexpected consequences. The reason for this was actually quite simple. As a large portion of the population died, the number of available workers dropped significantly. Labor suddenly became one of the most valuable resources. Survivors were able to demand higher wages and even set their own working conditions. Meanwhile, land and other valuable assets that were once difficult to access became much more available. People who had cash, silver, or trading capacity encountered opportunities they could never have imagined before. Lands that once sold for very high prices could now be purchased very cheaply, and abandoned houses and empty fields were waiting for new owners. Those who held power were no longer the sellers, but the buyers. If all of this sounds familiar to you, there is a good reason for that. Because a similar situation was experienced very recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the outbreak, production and supply chains were disrupted. In order to keep economies running, many countries injected trillions of dollars into the markets. However, this had an unexpected consequence. Wealth inequality became even deeper. Those who had cash on hand used this period as an opportunity and bought stocks, real estate, and other valuable assets. On the other hand, millions of people living on wages were left behind in the face of rising living costs. Especially in the United States, while housing prices increased rapidly and the stock market recovered quickly, for many people the biggest struggle was simply making it to the end of the month and paying rent. History repeatedly brings the same lessons back to us in different periods. Pandemics do not only change the lives of millions of people, they also cause wealth to be redistributed. After the Black Death, survivors strengthened their position in society by gaining better conditions due to the reduced labor force. Centuries later, a similar picture emerged during the COVID-19 period. Those who had sufficient cash were able to purchase homes, stocks, and companies that others were forced to sell. All of this shows us an important truth. Crises do not affect everyone in the same way. While those who are prepared can turn these periods into opportunities, those who are unprepared often pay the heaviest price. However, pandemics were not the only events that disrupted economies. History is full of different examples. One of them took place in Renaissance Florence. Even the most powerful banks of the time collapsed one after another, like a domino effect once people lost confidence. In the 1340s, Florence was one of the most important financial centers in Europe. The city was home to powerful banking families such as the Bardi and Peruzzi. These banks lent large sums not only to merchants, but also to the kings of Europe. One of their biggest borrowers was King Edward III of England. However, England's long wars with France began to strain its financial power. Eventually, Edward III was unable to repay his massive debts. When Edward III stopped paying his debts, things quickly spiraled out of control. Banks began to fail one after another. Fortunes that had been accumulated over many years suddenly disappeared, and trade nearly came to a halt. Florence, once one of the richest and most powerful cities in Europe, was quickly pushed into a deep economic crisis. The crisis in Florence taught people a very important lesson. No matter how large an institution is, it does not mean it is immune to collapse. Similarly, a strong reputation built over many years may not be enough to protect you in difficult times. Throughout history, people have fallen into the same mistake. They believed that large institutions were too big to fail. But history has repeatedly proven the opposite. It is important to remember a key truth. Banks and financial institutions do not operate to protect your savings, but to generate profit. If they ever find themselves in trouble, it is often the customers who pay the price. History has repeatedly shown us examples of this. Even after centuries, this lesson has not changed. From the banking crisis in Florence to the 2008 global financial crisis, and even the banking crisis in Lebanon in 2019, the same pattern has appeared again and again. Those who blindly trusted the system suffered the greatest losses, while those who recognized the risks early and acted accordingly experienced far less damage. Because in the financial world, no institution's guarantee lasts forever. Trust exists until it is broken. When we think of the American Civil War, most people imagine battlefield clashes, political tensions, and the abolition of slavery. However, there was another invisible front to this war, one fought not with weapons, but with money. And this struggle affected millions of lives just as deeply as the war itself. As the war dragged on, both the North and the South increasingly needed money. As a result, both sides began printing more currency to cover war expenses. In the North, the government introduced paper money called greenbacks, which was not backed by gold and relied solely on government trust. At first, this decision seemed logical, even necessary. However, as the amount of money in circulation increased, the value of these banknotes gradually began to decline. Purchasing power fell, inflation rose, and people's trust in money steadily weakened. In the South, the situation was far worse. The Confederate government, struggling to finance the war, began printing large amounts of its own currency called graybacks. However, as money in circulation increased, its value dropped at the same pace. By the end of the war, inflation had spiraled out of control. Prices rose dramatically, while wages lost their purchasing power day by day. Even when soldiers received their pay, the value of that money quickly eroded. People carried stacks of banknotes with them, yet still struggled to afford basic necessities. When the war ended in 1865, the Confederate currency had almost completely lost its value. People could no longer use those banknotes for everyday purchases as before. In such periods, what retained value was not paper money, but real assets. Land, gold, food, and essential goods still held their worth, while paper money continued to lose both trust and purchasing power. Those who suffered the most from this situation were ordinary people. Their life savings, built up over many years of hard work, lost value in a very short time. However, not everyone shared the same fate. Those who held gold, land, or other tangible assets were able to survive the period with much less damage. In some cases, the crisis even created unexpected opportunities. Many houses, lands, and properties changed hands at prices far below their real value. This is one of the lesser-known aspects of the American Civil War. Even the United States, today seen as one of the strongest economies in the world, once experienced a serious monetary crisis. At that time, what kept people afloat was not paper money in their pockets. The real difference came from holding gold, land, and other tangible assets that were less affected by inflation. A similar picture emerged a few years later, this time in France. After the French Revolution overthrew the monarchy, the state seized church-owned lands. It then issued a new paper currency called the assignat, backed by these lands as collateral. The goal was to revive the economy and stabilize the system. At first, the plan seemed promising. However, as the government continued to print money, the amount of currency in circulation increased rapidly. Each newly issued banknote gradually reduced the value of the existing ones. Before long, things began to spiral out of control. Prices rose rapidly while wages failed to keep up, and people's purchasing power steadily declined. The assignats lost value day by day. Eventually, farmers no longer wanted to sell their goods in exchange for paper money. Instead, they began demanding silver or other forms of real value. Bread riots broke out again in Paris, and the revolution found itself increasingly trapped within the very economic chaos it had tried to solve. Those who benefited most from this process were not those who trusted the government-issued paper money. People who held their wealth in real assets such as gold, food, or real estate were able to preserve most of their savings. In contrast, ordinary French citizens paid a heavy price. People realized, too late, that the value of money does not come from the promises of the government that issues it, but from the trust people place in it. When that trust disappears, not only money, but years of accumulated effort can be wiped out in a very short time. Nearly 200 years passed, yet little had changed. A similar crisis emerged in Asia. In 1997, a financial turmoil that began in Thailand quickly spread across much of Southeast Asia. For many years, Thailand had borrowed heavily in US dollars and kept its currency pegged to the dollar. The system worked smoothly as long as conditions remained stable. But once the balance shifted, everything changed suddenly. Foreign currency denominated debts quickly became unbearable. The impact of the crisis spread rapidly across the entire region. Foreign investors began pulling their money out of the countries. After Thailand, the currencies of Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea also sharply depreciated. Economies shrank, companies went bankrupt one after another, and unemployment rose rapidly. The situation became so severe that some countries were forced to seek support from the International Monetary Fund in order to stabilize their economies. However, the heaviest burden of this crisis was not carried by the large investors who exited the markets first. The real cost was once again paid by ordinary people. Savings lost value rapidly, loan burdens increased, and millions of people lost their jobs. A sudden change in economic conditions wiped out years of hard work in a very short time. But this crisis revealed another important truth. While those who kept their wealth only in local currency suffered far greater losses, those who held US dollars or foreign assets were able to go through the period with significantly less damage. Meanwhile, countries heavily dependent on foreign debt were forced to implement harsh austerity measures in order to keep their economies afloat. As the crisis deepened, international investors purchased many valuable companies and assets in Asia at prices far below their real value. At first glance, it appeared to be a local crisis. However, what was actually happening was a massive global transfer of wealth. From Byzantium to the Asian financial crisis, history has consistently delivered the same lesson. Borrowing in a foreign currency is one of the most dangerous traps in finance, because when things are going well, everyone appears to be winning. But when the storm hits, creditors remain on the safer side, while those carrying the debt are the first to collapse. Now, all the stories we have told point to a single truth. Geographies change, years pass, crisis names differ, but the outcome remains the same. Paper money loses value, debt burdens grow heavier, and those who are unprepared pay the highest price. In contrast, those who manage to survive are not the ones who blindly trust the system, but those who see its fragility in advance. However, there is a more striking reality. These stories we have told are not just confined to history books. Similar events have occurred very recently. One of the most striking examples of this was the economic crisis that began in Lebanon in 2019. One morning, people went to their banks only to discover that they could no longer access their accounts. Deposits were frozen and cash withdrawals were heavily restricted. At the same time, the country's currency began to rapidly lose value. The Lebanese lira lost more than 90% of its value in a very short period. Years of savings were almost completely wiped out within months. In long queues outside banks, people waited just to access their own money, but they kept receiving the same answer: "You cannot access your account at this time." At that moment, many people realized a painful truth. Money in a bank is yours only as long as you can actually access it. Moreover, this crisis did not only affect low-income individuals. Doctors, engineers, retirees, small business owners, and middle-class families who had saved for years also experienced the same helplessness. In short, everyone who trusted the system and entrusted their future to banks paid the price of this crisis. What happened in Lebanon revealed a truth that many people had never considered. Bank deposits are not stored in a locked safe that belongs to you, as most people assume. When you deposit your money in a bank, you are essentially entrusting it to the bank for use within the system. As long as everything runs normally, this system works without issues. However, during a major crisis, there's no guarantee that you will be able to access your money whenever you want. So who are the least affected by all of this? Those who did not rely on a single system. Those who diversified their savings into gold, real estate, or assets in different countries, and those who spread their risks in advance managed to survive the period with much less damage. In contrast, those who tied their entire future to a single bank, a single currency, or a single system had to face the most severe consequences of the crisis. If you think all of this only happened in other countries, just look at 2008. In the United States, millions of people lost their homes and lost most of their retirement savings. Meanwhile, many major banks that were considered responsible for the crisis continued operating thanks to government support. Then in 2020, the world faced the COVID-19 pandemic. To prevent the global economy from collapsing, central banks and governments injected trillions of dollars into the markets. In the short term, this helped stabilize the economy. However, it also had consequences. Prices of stocks, real estate, and other assets rose rapidly. Those who already owned assets became significantly wealthier, while millions living on salaries were unable to increase their income at the same pace. As the cost of living rose, their purchasing power steadily weakened. The year 2023 was another reminder of the same lesson. In the United States, several regional banks were forced to shut down within just a few days. Institutions that had inspired trust for years came under immense pressure as people began withdrawing their money at the same time. Once again, it became clear that what keeps a bank alive is not only its balance sheet, but the trust people place in it. When that trust is shaken, even the strongest institutions can quickly come under stress. Too big to fail. Perhaps one of the most repeated phrases in finance. But history has repeatedly proven that this statement is often not true, because no system is perfect, and no institution can guarantee that it will last forever. The real question is this: when such times come, how will you protect your wealth? So what does history actually tell us? There is no single correct answer. Conditions change from one era to another, and what protects people also changes accordingly. In Byzantium, it was gold that preserved wealth. After the Black Death, those who had cash on hand were the ones who seized opportunities. In Florence, people painfully learned that even the largest financial institutions could fail. During the American Civil War, those who preserved their wealth were not the holders of paper money, but those who owned land, gold, and other real assets. In France, the safe haven people turned to was food and land. During the Asian financial crisis, those who avoided borrowing in foreign currency suffered far less damage. In Lebanon, those who were able to move their assets out of the system before the banks closed were the least affected. The examples change, the geographies change, the centuries change. But there is one constant truth. Real security does not come from blindly trusting paper money or institutions. It comes from holding assets that do not completely lose their value even during major crises. Perhaps the most interesting lesson in history is this: every crisis does not mean the same thing for everyone. For some, it is a period where savings disappear and hope is lost. For others, it becomes a turning point where major opportunities emerge. The difference is not luck. It is preparation, owning the right assets, and remaining calm instead of panicking. After the Black Death, many peasants had the opportunity to own land for the first time in their lives, because there was plenty of land to be worked, but very few people left to work it. Centuries later, during the 2008 financial crisis, a similar situation occurred. While millions of people lost their homes, investors with cash on hand were able to buy real estate at prices far below their real value. History reminds us of something important. Protecting yourself is not only about avoiding risks, it is also about being in a position to take advantage of opportunities that others are forced to give up. But real wealth is not only measured by what you own, it is also related to what you can produce. Throughout history, those who remained standing were not only those who owned gold or land, bakers who could produce bread, artisans who could repair what was broken, farmers who could feed people, merchants who could keep trade running. They did not just survive crises, they also managed to stay strong and even grow stronger within them, because economic systems may change and the value of money may be shaken. But the ability to produce, provide solutions, and meet needs never loses its value. People will always need to eat, shelter themselves, produce and trade under all conditions. Those who can meet these basic needs will never become completely powerless in the long run. This is the real security. Not blindly trusting banks or governments, but owning real assets, developing value-creating skills, and remembering that no system lasts forever. Because every crisis is not only a collapse, but also a transfer of wealth, from the unprepared to the prepared, from paper promises to real values, from passive savers to productive individuals. History has been repeating this cycle for centuries. That is why the real question is not whether everything will eventually collapse, because history has already shown us that sooner or later it will. The real question is this: when that day comes, will you be left with nothing but broken promises, or with something that holds real value? Because history does not repeat itself in exactly the same way. But if you refuse to learn from it, it will make you experience the same outcomes, only in a much harsher way. If this video gave you a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because history has already given the answers, I am simply here to show where those answers are hidden.